After midnight, people do not become philosophical in a noble way. They just lie there with the phone inside their hand, the room too quiet, and the screen suddenly feeling like a negotiation with the self. You are not happy, but calling it loneliness would require more honesty than the moment can afford. Your thumb moves before intention catches up, and you open something. Stimulation, Instagram, an old message thread, a dating app you said you deleted, or some fantasy that has already disappointed you 3 times this month. You call it boredom because boredom sounds less embarrassing than emotional hunger. And this is where sex flow becomes darker than dating. The last episode was about how modern dating made desire liquid. This episode is about what comes back through that liquid. In cash flow, the question is simple: did the money return? In sex flow, the question is quieter: did the fantasy return? Did you feel wanted for a second? Could the little panic shut up long enough for you to sleep? Was the wound allowed to become pleasure before it became a question? That is the part people avoid. They think fantasy is an escape from reality, but often fantasy is reality wearing a mask because the person cannot face it directly. A person does not always go to sex because they are full of desire. Sometimes they go there because every other emotion has failed to find a language. Sex becomes the final form of an emotional pressure that never got metabolized. Anxiety often cannot be categorized or expressed clearly, so it shows up through physical sensations in the body. Shame, less direct, tries to pass as desirability. Loneliness does not ask for home, it settles for heat. And the modern person who thinks he is very liberated often cannot tell the difference, not due to his stupidity, but because the system gave him stimulation before it gave him meaning. There is a hierarchy of emotional pressure. At the bottom, there is ordinary discomfort. You can still distract yourself with work, food, noise, or pretending to be busy. Anxiety comes next. Under it is the fear of being unwanted. If we go further, it is the humiliation of wondering whether being fully seen would make you impossible to choose. When that pressure climbs high enough, sex appeals as the most intense available language. The hand, the breath, the screen, the body trying to say what the mouth has avoided. Not that sex is low by its nature, but because sex is powerful enough to carry feelings that weaker language cannot hold. George Bataille has a line in Eroticism. Eroticism, it may be said, is ascending to life up to the point of death. Astonishingly, it names the edge people keep approaching without admitting it. It sounds dramatic until you look at what people actually do with desire. Bataille was not talking about your sad little midnight scroll, obviously. He means the essence beneath these apparent behaviors. Eroticism is not just pleasure, it is life pushing itself toward an edge. Sex flow is the emotional pressure, ascending to life up to the point of another temporary release. The point is that sex often becomes the extreme stage where hidden emotions finally dare to manifest. That is why fantasy feels so convincing. It does not merely show you a body, it gives your emotional chaos a scene. In that scene, you might be wanted, powerful, forgiven without apology. Sometimes you're simply young again, spared for a moment from the insult of time. The fantasy works because the wound gets a costume, not a cure. If that sounds offensive, good, a lot of modern self-talk exists to make sure people never have to say what is actually happening. They say it is just your pleasure, your body, your choice. Fine, but if it is just pleasure, why does it feel so personal when the fantasy stops working? And why can a screen that shows nothing real still change the temperature of your room? Why does rejection feel like a market correction on your soul? Buffett, summarizing John Burr Williams, gives a brutal finance formula. The value of any stock, bond, or business today is determined by the cash inflows and outflows. It is a money code, but the machine underneath it matters here. The value of the business is not the story it tells, it is what comes back. Translated into sex flow, the fantasy is valued by what it can return emotionally. A fantasy proves its value by returning attention, proof, and just enough desirability to keep the person functioning. The loop does not care whether you became whole, it only cares that you came back. That is why fantasy is both the product and the receipt. You consume it and then it proves the wound still responds. If every round of desire leaves you slightly more empty but still willing to repeat, that is not a failure. That is the design. This is where porn fits sex flow almost too perfectly. Porn's power is not sex itself, it is fantasy without the cost of being known. No negotiation, no awkward tenderness. No one gets close enough to see the parts of you that you cannot easily hide, polish, or control. Just a scene where desire arrives almost obedient. That is why it feels easier than intimacy. Intimacy asks the person to become real. Fantasy is cheaper. It asks for attention, and attention is exactly what the system has already trained you to surrender. The feed wants your attention to keep moving, so let's interrupt it in the most annoying way possible. If this frame is useful, don't confess in the comments. Name the cultural fantasy modern life sells the hardest. People pretend the fantasy is personal because admitting it was mass-produced would ruin the vibe. The fantasy does not look the same at every class level. The form of sex flow changes depending on where you stand. At the bottom, it often appears as a cheap fantasy and instant stimulation after exhaustion, like cheap fast food. Exhaustion makes immediate escape feel less like indulgence and more like medicine. Among the anxious middle, sex flow becomes more polite. It becomes situationships, healing language, and the careful performance of being emotionally unavailable in a mature way. People do not say, "I'm afraid of being known." They say, "I'm not ready for labels." Sometimes it is true, but sometimes it is velvet wrapped around emotional circulation. Among the protected rich, sex flow becomes aestheticized. Bodies are curated. Devotion is discreet, sometimes paid, and every room is designed so nothing emotionally inconvenient has to speak. This is why elite sexual scandals reveal more than hypocrisy. I'm not naming anyone. Everyone knows the kind of scandal I mean. Private islands, client lists, and the disgusting confidence of people who thought money could protect their fantasy from reality. The most revealing part is not only the crime, it is the taste. The symbols are always so ugly, childish, theatrical, pseudo-mystical, full of power worship, pretending to be the transcendence. That is what people miss. Lawyers, trusts, share structures, private jets, NDAs, calendar euphemisms, assistants who know not to ask. At the level of desire, the symbols often become childish, theatrical, and spiritually embarrassing. Money polishes the visible side. Desire, left uneducated, often returns as childish theater. That is the imbalance. A society can be brilliant with money and primitive in desire. It can build financial systems that move billions across continents and still express sex through images that look like they were designed by a spiritually neglected teenager. That is not an accident. Cash flow trains the visible side to behave. Sex flow reveals what the invisible side has become. And when the two split too far apart, you get a culture that can calculate everything except why its fantasies are so ugly. The point is not to become less sexual. The harder the question is whether sex is carrying emotions that should have become wisdom somewhere else. Maybe the desire was not only desire. Maybe the climax was anxiety trying to find loudest exit, shame trying to become proof, loneliness borrowing the body because the soul had become socially embarrassing. That is why sex flow is so hard to see. It hides inside the most intense form of release. People assume the intensity proves authenticity, but intensity only proves that pressure found an exit. A scream can be honest and still not be wisdom. A fantasy can be powerful and still not to be love. A climax can feel final and still leave the original wound untouched. So the episode's frame is simple. Cash flow asks what money returns. Sex flow asks what fantasy returns. Porn removes the cost of being known. Situationships remove the burden of form. Elite scandals reveal what happens when money matures and desire does not. All of them belong to the same problem. The old egg keeps finding new interfaces, and because stimulation feels like proof, people mistake movement for healing. The question is not whether fantasy is evil or whether fantasy is dirty. The question is whether fantasy is helping you understand the wound, or is it simply keeping the wound rentable? The question is not whether sex has become the final emergency exit for emotions that no longer know how to become some meaning. Modern people call this freedom because the alternative would require stillness, and stillness is where the fantasy stops performing. That is where the person has to ask a much worse question. What if the person was looking for a form strong enough to hold what sex only helps release? That is where the next episode goes. Because if fantasy is the product, then love cannot merely be a better fantasy. Love has to interrupt the system's favorite trick, keeping desire moving without letting it become form. It has to make desire stop circulating and start taking form.